So hopefully you get plenty out of tonight. As ever with these sessions, they are very much about what you take away from them. I've got quite a lot of ground to cover, but obviously the main thing is that you know, if you've got pressing questions or site-specific questions, then we'll do our best to sort of cover those this evening. Hopefully, I've left enough time in the agenda to deal with questions as we go. So next slide, please, Vicky. Yeah, so just a brief introduction to me. I think I know a lot of you that are online tonight, but I'm the Senior Regional Pitch Advisor for football at the Grounds Management Association. So I've been a Regional Pitch Advisor since 2018. I have previously had a hybrid cricket and football role, but I've also worked in professional football for over a decade. I was head groundsman at Coventry City for 5 years. And more importantly, I've been a grassroots volunteer for over 20, much like many of you on the call tonight. So I share your pain with what we've been going through this winter. Next slide, please, Vicky. Yes, a brief introduction to the Grounds Management Association. So we are the leading membership organisation for the grounds management industry. So we champion everybody that works within grounds management, from the volunteer all the way through to those that work at elite stadia. We advocate for the industry. We own and operate the Grounds Management Association Saltex, which happens at the NEC every year. Coming up, week commencing the 23rd of March, we've got Grounds Week, which is our annual awareness campaign celebrating and promoting the grounds industry. And we also have our industry awards annually, of which there are two categories that are relevant to community sport. Next page, please, Vic. Yeah, we are, as I say, we are a membership organisation. Within our organisation category, we've got our community membership, which is £93. And through that, you can access technical resources, recordings of all our Saltex Learning Live seminars, up to 30% discount on GMA training and qualifications, and some of the other benefits that you can see on screen there too. Next slide, please, Vicky. And my role in particular is working within the Pitch Advisory Service. Sorry, so that this is a program that we deliver on behalf of Sport England and the Football Foundation. And within that, we cover football, cricket, and both codes of rugby. We provide either remote support or on-site visits, guidance in selecting the right maintenance machinery and equipment, supporting you with access to funding opportunities through the governing bodies. Obviously, training and education is a big part of our offer as well, and also supporting you with signposting to specialist services such as drainage and pitch construction consultancy. Next slide, please, Vicky. So getting straight into tonight's topic, so rain soaked to game ready. So hopefully coming off the back of tonight, we'll have a better understanding of what we've all been experiencing this winter, why we've experienced it, whether it's going to be more of a trend in the years to come. And then we're going to dive into some do's and don'ts and best practice about how we can help to get our pitches in the best condition possible coming out of this winter. Next slide, please, Vicky. So discussion points tonight. So we're going to be having a look at the winter so far. It's probably fairly obvious what it's been doing, but we'll cover that off. As I said, we'll be looking at our weather extremes becoming more frequent, why certain pitches might be experiencing particular problems with drainage, and are we doing anything to contribute to that problem? How to make best use of weather forecasts, what we can do to recover our pitches, and then we'll be looking at pitch renovations as spring approaches as well. Next slide, please, Vicky. So I thought it'd be useful given the weather that we've had, to just look a little bit into why kind of the central band of the country into kind of the southwest and southern England have been suffering so much this winter. Um, and basically the the weather pattern's been caused by an unusually southerly jet stream that's given us a succession of low pressure systems and storms. We've obviously seen very regular rainfall. And what's been quite unusual about this weather pattern is how slowly these weather fronts have cleared. So it's generally known as a low block. So meteorologists will kind of use that as a term for a low pressure system that hangs around for a long time, unfortunately. Probably not news to any of you, but across the UK, over 26 weather stations in various areas have recorded their wettest ever January. And the data, which was up to date when these slides were produced at the 8th of February, England had already exceeded its average winter rainfall by 111%. So it has been an exceptionally wet winter across the board. So having a bit of a chuckle with my colleague from the northwest earlier, because he's usually making lots of jokes about how wet it is and how hard they've got it up there. But actually this winter, it's been the central band and sort of south of the country that's been particularly hit. We had already seen 72% our usual February rainfall by the 8th of February, versus 39% in the north of the country. So actually, as you can see from the map there, the white areas getting into the blue spots are kind of the worst affected in terms of average rainfall. So actually, you can see the areas of the country that have really been hammered this winter, which incorporates a lot of kind of my East Midlands, West Midlands patch that I support. Herefordshire and Worcestershire probably the worst affected amongst that. 40 days of consecutive rainfall between 31st of December and the 8th of February. And as I said, that map kind of puts it in fairly clear terms that we have copped a lot of the bad weather, along with areas of the southwest and south coast. Next slide, please, Vicky. So I suppose as importantly as what we're seeing when we're looking out the window at the moment is to sort of try and get a bit of a grasp for future maintenance of our pitches as to whether this is, you know, are these one-offs or are these becoming more of a trend? And obviously last winter was a fairly dry, decent one leading into a dry spring. And then a warm, dry summer that caused its own issues. But the previous winter to that, which you'll all remember, was an absolute stinker as well, probably even worse than the one that we've been through at the moment, in as much as I think it started raining in October and didn't stop until mid-April from memory. But 2025 became the warmest year on record. 4 of the 5 warmest years on record have been since 2020. What this actually means in terms of what impact that has on the weather is that 1 degree above average doesn't sound like a lot, but actually it means that the atmosphere can hold up to 7% more water vapor for every degree of warming. So that's what it actually means in real terms. And what that leads to is when it rains harder. I've certainly noticed a anecdotal trend that a lot of grounds people talk about since I've been in the industry, which, as I said, is approaching 20 years. That drizzle is a bit of a thing of the past, and that we're now seeing more intense, harder periods of rainfall when it does rain, and that's now kind of backed up by the data as well. So heavier downpours, more intense downpours, increased flooding risks, and winters are projected to become wetter overall, with an increase in those short, intense downpours. So the wettest days that we're seeing are now giving us 15 to 20% more rain than compared with several decades ago. So if you weren't already depressed after the winter that we've had, that's not good news either, I'm afraid, with what we can expect in the years to come. Next slide, please, Vicky. Um, so I thought it'd be worthwhile looking at, people that ring me up and sort of say, why won't my pitch drain? It's worse than it normally is. Um, and I thought it'd be worthwhile touching a little bit on sort of what that looks like and some of the reasons for that. So, um, as we've observed kind of anecdotally, and we've now backed up with the data, rainfall events are much more intense. So, pitches that have never historically had problems with drainage, um, lots of grounds people kind of now saying to me, rain seems to be coming on a Thursday and a Friday, writing our games off on a Saturday. It never used to be a problem. Don't understand why it's gotten so bad. Um, well, in short, it's because the rainfall is now more intense. It's heavier when it comes, and it's taking that bit longer with that intensity of rainfall and how much rain we're getting in short periods. For pitches that are predominantly undrained in the grassroots game, to drain through and cope. And what that means is that our soils are remaining saturated for longer. Wet soils are more easily compacted through machinery use and play. And what compaction leads to is slower drainage, meaning that the soils absorb less water and increases the amount of water runoff we get. And in terms of the impact that has on grass health and what we see in terms of the grass plant, it means a reduction in the amount of oxygen that it gets, and it means that the grass is not recovering as well either. Next slide, please, Vicky. So why does my pitch drain so slowly? So in the East and West Midlands, large amounts of the soils are described as slowly permeable loamy and clay soils. There's an excellent website that's run by Cranfield University called the Land Information System, or Landis as it's sometimes called, and they have a soilscapes resource on there where you can put in your postcode and it'll give you a brief summary of your soil types, whether you're likely to have risk of flooding or whether you can expect what's described as kind of wet and saturated soil, seasonally wet soils. And 55% of the UK is on clay rich or loamy soils, which do tend to drain more slowly. And what that means is that these soils, without getting too scientific on you, have very small soil particles, meaning that there isn't much pore space. So that is the spaces that sit between those soil particles that we're relying on for water, oxygen, nutrients to move. And what that means is that those soils hold water at the surface. Heavy soils can stay wet for days after rainfall. And obviously, when you're getting prolonged, persistent rainfall like we've been seeing, it's kind of one step forward, two steps back. And compacted clay soils can drain at less than a millimetre per hour. So if we're regularly seeing rainfall events that are sort of 3 millimeters an hour or more, and basically if that rain comes at the wrong time, you're going to see cancellations, postponements, and standing water on your pitches. Next slide, please, Vicky. So am I contributing to the problem? The reason why I thought it'd be worthwhile talking about this is I always remember a particular occasion when I was looking after pitches at Coventry's training ground. And Tony Mowbray, I had a fantastic relationship with, an absolute brilliant bloke to work with, came to me and said, it's Thursday, which is the main training day for professional football. And he said to me, we've absolutely got to train today. I need to get some hours into the legs of the players. I know that the weather is absolutely horrendous. I think it was December at the time. Pitches, we didn't have drainage on those training pitches. The site sat in a bowl, and basically, you'll be glad to know this picture wasn't taken from those pictures, I'm glad to say, but it was a it was a situation that wasn't that dissimilar, whereby the pitches were saturated. So we didn't have standing water at the prior to the training session, but the weather forecast was absolutely shocking. Um, I said to Tony, probably the only thing I'm going to be able to do is to put a vertidrain through the pitch and open it up and get some holes into it. But I said the consequence of doing that, because the soil is already saturated, is that probably you're now going to lose 3 or 4 training sessions in the weeks and months ahead that otherwise would have gone forward. Which is exactly what proved to be the case. We spiked the pitches, the training session got on, but what we ended up with, because where you put a solid tine into saturated soils, basically what you do is create a test tube. So if you imagine running your finger down wet plasticine, which is kind of the anecdote I always use, it kind of seals it up and smooths the side. And that's basically what happens in a clayey, loamy soil when you put a solid tine into it. And what you're left with is test tubes full of water. So the point that I'm trying to get to is, when did you last deep spike your pitch? So if it's never been done, have we ever relieved that compaction that is so detrimental to infiltration rates and getting the water through the profile? A pitch that is verti-drained preventatively in the autumn before heavy rain comes, can improve infiltration by 2 or 3 fold. So the point that I'm trying to get to is, actually, whilst we're now sort of in the eye of the storm, hopefully starting to come through it, it's very much kind of thinking ahead into next autumn about, what work can we be looking at to try and make sure that our pitches are as best prepared as they can be going into the winter. So benefits of deep spiking: helps water drain through to the subsoil, um, good for oxygen exchange, great for root development, both in terms of root depth and root density. What it won't do is miraculously kind of turn your clay soil into the best draining pitch ever. So sometimes with verti-draining, people say to me, "Oh, we did it, it was a waste of time." And it's actually kind of managing your expectations of what you expect from that work being done. It can be really effective, but again, it has to be done at the right time when soil conditions are kind of moist but not already wet. Equally, as I mentioned, using machinery in the wrong conditions will actually make things worse. So, in our kind of desperation, when we get a winter like we've had, the temptation can be to call in a contractor or get out with the slitter or our own machinery and sort of try and start putting holes in a pitch that's already saturated, soggy, and actually, whilst we're in our best intentions trying to sort of improve a problem, what it's actually probably going to do is actually make it worse. So what I would sort of stress is very much trying to sort of do those works at the right time. And I appreciate the maintenance windows have been so small this winter. It's kind of any dry day seems to be fair game to go out and do something, but it's probably still going to be a case that a bit of patience in keeping that kit in the shed for a little bit longer is going to be your best course of action at the moment. Point out that fairly obvious is that play in saturated conditions are going to worsen that compaction. Um, and grounds people are often criticised for being overprotective of our pitches, but actually strategic postponements, postponing when it's really 50-50, can actually mean that future games, future training sessions are far more likely to go ahead. So when you're actually thinking about fixture backlogs and whether we should play or whether we shouldn't, or whether we should train or whether we shouldn't, the more usage in saturated conditions, when you can draw water up underfoot, or even worse, standing water, is going to, significantly increase the likelihood that games that should have been played, training that should have gone ahead later in the winter won't. So yeah, just a little think about there about what you've been doing this winter, and actually where the sum of what you've done may be contributing to the problem. Next slide, please, Vicky. So understanding how your site drains. So I've tried to rejig these slides a little bit from kind of the coping with pitch use and weather that we've done in the last few years. And it's really important when we've got a poorly draining pitch to sort of try and begin to understand what that looks like. So have you got any drainage, historical drainage, and do you have any sort of an idea as to what condition it's in? So have you got any inspection chambers that you can look at and see if water is flowing through any manholes, etc.? Even better, have you got means of getting a camera down there and investigating the condition of your pipe drainage and seeing whether it's still intact and functional? Where the drainage comes out, so we call that the outfall. Have you inspected that to make sure that ditches are clear? There aren't any roots growing in there. There's no blockages or things that are slowing that down. It's basically like a gutter at home. If you've got leaves and muck blocking it, it will stop the water from coming out. So, having to think about actually, we've got drainage, it's not working very well. Why isn't it working very well? Probably worth mentioning at that point that any drainage system that's kind of north of 15 to 20 years old is probably going to be significantly less effective than it was when it was first installed, and that sounds sort of fairly obvious. But I do go to sites where I get people say, well, we've got land drains that were put in 30, 40 years ago. And the likelihood is that they're not going to be doing what we need them to do. So again, thinking about what we can do to kind of improve the functionality of those drains. It might be that we need to consider reinstalling some secondary drainage, so sand slits, sand bands, gravel slits that will sort of connect the pitch surface with the pipe drains below if we still think that they're functional and working as we'd like. But yeah, just food for thought. Organic matter, or thatch as it's sometimes referred to, can act like a sponge in soils as well and retain an awful lot of water. So again, those of you that are making use of pitch power annually or a few times a year, do you have a significant amount of organic matter? That's probably going to be north of kind of 15, 10, 15 mil, 20 mil. North of that, it's probably going to be causing you to retain a fair bit of water when we get rainfall. Do you know what the makeup of your topsoil and subsoil is? So, I go to some sites where the topsoil is actually quite nicely structured and relatively free draining, but actually they've got some pretty horrible clay subsoils below that. And essentially once that subsoil becomes saturated, there's nowhere for the water to drain away naturally, or it's going to drain very slowly. So again, trying to arm yourself with the knowledge of what is sat under the surface of your pitch can be very helpful. Again, when you're taking any samples, have you got any soil debris? So you've got stones, bricks, or really hard pans in that soil that might slow water penetration. Do you know if you've got a high water table? And you can do a bit of a DIY infiltration test to assess how quickly your pitch drains. And the reason why that's useful, I'll make a bit more sense in a minute. I won't kind of take you through step by step what that looks like, but it's essentially using a metal cylinder or a plastic cylinder that you fill with water, measure the time and the rate at which that water drains through, and then that can give you a means of converting how many millimeters an hour, your pitch can cope with in terms of rainfall. And that'll be clear in a minute as to why that's helpful. Next slide, please, Vicky. So the reason why that's helpful is because it can then help us to use weather forecasts proactively to give us a bit of an idea of the rainfall that's expected in a given time period, and give you some sort of non-subjective view as to whether your pitch is likely to be able to cope with that. So we can kind of see here that between uh, precipitation that's predicted between 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon is 4 millimeters. So you can generally, with detailed forecasts, break that down even further by hour. And you can then do various things. So you can either do what we discussed for the infiltration test, or you can get a rain gauge and start to get a bit of a clearer idea of how much rain it's going to take for your pitch to be unplayable. So say, typically you figure out that typically following 25 millimeters of rain in 24 hours, your pitch is playable. So actually it drains pretty reasonably for a grassroots pitch. But you're looking at the forecast, and 35 millimeters of rain is forecast, then you probably know that you're going to be in trouble. You can have that rain gauge at your house if you live close to the site, don't have to collect it on site. But as I said, we've mentioned it a few times, but what we are seeing more and more is extreme rainfall events that are seeing large amounts of this rainfall fall in a short period of time. So that can help you in terms of your communication with match officials, parents, players, committee members, whatever it might be, to try and make some sort of a fairly educated guess as to whether your scheduled game or training sessions are going to be on or not. Next slide, please, Vicky. Probably a good time just to ask if there's any questions before I kind of dive into the next bit. If anybody's got anything in the chat or anything else, that if not, I'll move on. Oh, good. Right, next slide then, please, Vicky. So, what can we do when the weather's like it has been? So, goal area repairs, my absolute kind of bugbear. Is seeing goal mouths like this, particularly if they're the reason why games are being lost. Fairly avoidable. Sand dressing, forking those areas, making sure that we try and keep them level with the surrounding ground. So even if they're devoid of grass coverage, trying to kind of replicate what we would do with a deep spiker and sort of have a closely spaced holes that we put in with a simple garden fork, incorporating some free draining sport sand into that area and trying to brush and rake that into the holes, and keeping that area level will help to keep that area as free draining as possible. If you think we've got potentially a big lump of a goalkeeper stood in that spot for quite a long time, again, a lot of compaction that's happening in that area. So that's something to think about if this picture looks familiar to you. And then the other one that's onerous, nobody enjoys it, nobody wants to do it, but divoting pitches is probably the single most important practice that you can be undertaking during the winter months to maintain grass coverage, maintain pitch levels, try and avoid having a bobbly pitch. And any time that you can spend doing that is worthwhile, even if it's a half an hour walk over the pitch, putting the real biggest stuff back. It's worthwhile doing. Next slide, please, Vicky.
quick
So in
one.
terms of goal area repairs, a quick run through the materials and tools that we might need. So as I mentioned, an appropriately draining sport sand, a pan shovel, a wheelbarrow, a rake, some grass seed if weather conditions are suitable and we think we've got a chance of germination, and a good quality garden fork, as I mentioned. Next slide, please, Vicky. And step by step, so I mentioned in terms of trying to replicate that whole pattern of a deep spiker. You do that with your fork and you just have that slightly fracturing motion with the fork once you've got it in the ground that you'd be familiar with, putting the fork in the ground, give it a little wiggle, and that's kind of the fracturing effect that helps to decompact that soil. We then incorporate the sport sand using the pan shovel, and we want to really be looking to do this little and often. So I'm not talking about putting on a big load that's going to be kind of unstable and unpleasant to be standing on or diving around in. It's just a little dusting, and this needs to be something that we're trying to do on a regular basis to keep the levels and keep the area free draining throughout the winter. As I mentioned, if we're getting into the time of year that we are now and temperatures are on the increase, we can start to think about incorporating a little bit of perennial ryegrass seed in with that. Raking it in with a plastic landscaping rake, and the purpose of that is it helps to get the sand in the holes, but also it helps to just get the sand off the grass leaf and make sure that we're not suffocating the grass that might be underneath that sand. So again, not putting too much down and just making sure that we're lightly raking it into the surface. And then hopefully it'll look something like that image where you've got a nice kind of tilt of sport sand with some seed incorporated if appropriate. And not going to be applicable to this time of year, certainly with the amount of rainfall we're experiencing, but you can use germination sheeting, or a kind of a more affordable alternative is scaffold netting, to cover up those areas, and that'll help just to protect it from pests or unofficial usage, and also helps to accelerate the germination of the seed that's in there. And scaffold netting in particular is very affordable, and not a disaster if it gets kind of damaged or pinched, in terms of getting a biggish roll of that and being able to secure it down with pegs. Next slide, please, Vicky. So I just wanted to go into decompaction and aeration in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Vic. So other than the hand repairs that we've already kind of spoken about, and obviously they'll be applicable to penalty spots, corner spots, linesman's runs, technical areas, anywhere that's going to get a lot of traffic in a localized area. But once we kind of get to the point where we think, okay, the pitches are starting to dry out now, when would be a good time for me to think about getting that deep spiking done, relieving that compaction that's built up over the winter. This image here just gives you a little bit of a graphic of what that pore space looks like that I was talking about. So we can see there on kind of a normal soil what that looks like and how it helps water and oxygen and nutrients to travel through the soil. And on the right will be what a lot of pitches are looking like after the sort of winter that we've experienced, where there isn't much space there for the water to drain through and for the oxygen to circulate. Next slide, please, Vicky. So in terms of what those methods look like, and what the kind of the best timing might be. So kind of deep spiking, which is the top image there, which is commonly called vertidraining. That is basically the use typically on a football pitch of solid tines. They vary in size in terms of diameter and the depth that they can work to on a grassroots pitch. We may be able to do this operation once or twice a year. We ideally want to be using an 18mm tine to a 24mm tine that's going to work to an absolute minimum of 6 inches, 100mm or 150mm, sorry, or potentially a little bit deeper than that ideally. Those of you that have been doing this practice for a little while will probably be able to work to a greater depth potentially. Those of you that are doing it for the first time, a fairly fair indication of where the machine and what depth it can work to is if the machine starts bouncing, then you know it's probably as deep as it can go, and they might need to adjust it to be a slightly shallower. Benefits of deep spiking. It can be done more or less at any time of year, so it doesn't encourage cracking in the way that some of the other practices can. It's probably the one to go for if you're looking at doing some decompaction work in March, April time, as we come out of this winter. And basically the way that it works is as the machine moves forward, the tines go in the ground, and then the small amount of heave can be applied to those tines, and that means that they're entering the ground at a slight angle. And as the machine moves forward, it's that fracturing effect that we want, where it's actually giving us that decompaction of the soil. You can also use these machines purely as an aerator, where they're kind of going in at 90 degrees, but basically what you're doing there is just you're punching holes and aerating, rather than actually doing that decompaction work that we're going to be looking for. They're also powered linear decompaction machines. So again, to kind of make sense of that, often referred to as shock waves or earthquakes or vertiquakes. That is the machine at the bottom. So that is a powered basically slitting knife on a drum that's going through the surface and will leave you long linear channels that go the length of the pitch. A particularly good operation in the autumn before we get that saturation that we were talking about. Particularly effective if we're looking to do one of these tasks just for a drainage benefit, as opposed to a oxygen exchange route development. That decompaction can be particularly effective because it creates those kind of linear channels for the water to get down and go through, and they can last quite a long time in the soil as well. Where it isn't appropriate is probably when we're getting into this time of year, particularly if you've got clay soils. If we were to experience a drought summer as we did last year, those channels can crack and open up on pitches that are clay or loamy in particular. So again, with these jobs, it's kind of thinking about when we're doing them and what's the right practice at the right time. That middle image there is kind of a more common aeration technique. It's a deep slitter. So that is the one that we would kind of look to do in between the verti-draining or the shock waving aeration. So that is the task that, if soil conditions are right, we would do on a more regular basis. Core tying, an interesting question. I'm not an enormous advocate for hollow coring football pitches. The main reason being that in my experience, on clay loamy soils, often what happens is that those core tines clog up, and actually what you end up doing is kind of punching holes with a clogged up hollow tine, rather than using a solid tine. If you've got sandy soils, or you've got a freer draining soil, hollow coring can work quite well. Or if you're doing a localized area, because obviously that is removing that material from the ground, and keeping those kind of holes that will last a little bit longer. But then you've obviously got to think about how you're going to remove those cores from that area as well. So again, with the verti-draining machine, there are lots of different tines, lots of options there. But it's going to be the right soil type if you're considering hollow coring. As I mentioned with the slitting, again, we want the soil conditions for all of these to be moist but not wet equally. We don't want it to be too dry because it'll be difficult getting the machine to work effectively, and has the potential to cause some surface disruption as well if the conditions are too dry. So, with these works, the windows can be quite narrow, and that's where it gets quite tricky. If we're relying on contractors booking these works in, there's probably going to be kind of a 4 to 6 week window, back end of September into October, where the decompaction works are going to be at their optimum. And then again, kind of coming into this time of year, it might be sort of, dependent on how quickly this this wet spell kind of moves on and sort of start to dry out again. It probably a 4 to 6 week period, mid to back end of March into April. And then potentially, depending on what sort of spring we have, it could start getting a little bit firm by May. So again, the tricky thing with these windows is that they are quite small. But as I said, it's very much about trying to get this work done at the right time. Next slide, please, Vicky. So I thought it'd be useful, which we haven't discussed on sort of previous sessions, to actually look at some of the machines that we could consider if pitches are already waterlogged. So if we're already saturated and we're already underwater, what can we consider using? And in recent years, kind of deep air injection is probably the most viable operation to be considering if you've got a pitch that's already got standing water on it. An Air 2G2 is quite a common machine that's been around for probably a decade or more now. That basically probes go in the ground and they laterally inject pressurized air, creating that kind of fracturing effect on the soils below. And these machines are low impact, so they can be used. They're generally, have much less impact on the surface than a tractor would, for instance. And come with kind of flotation tires that again are sort of sensitive to being used in wet conditions. Another one below, terrain aeration, which is a kind of a more invasive, deeper version of the Air 2G2, that injects high pressure compressed air and incorporates dried milled seaweed. The Air 2G2 would probably be more akin to the verti-draining or the shock waving job in terms of the cost. It may be a little bit more. The terrain aeration one is a more kind of invasive, long-lasting system. But again, I appreciate for a lot of you, kind of some of these works are going to be out of budget, but I think it'd be important to kind of look at, some of the things that you could consider doing if you really, really are stuck and thinking, what on earth can we do to try and get water through our pitch? So injection of compressed air, this work can be done and the pitch kind of played on straight away, so it's not kind of disruptive to the pitch surface. And will probably help to get surface water away to a degree. Next slide, please, Vicky. So just to touch briefly before we sort of move on to the pitch renovation element of tonight, what we are seeing is a moving trend towards wetter winters overall. And for those of you that have been in receipt of Football Foundation funding, grassroots maintenance funding, some of you may be getting to the point now where we're saying, actually, we know what our soils are like. We know that drainage is a perennial problem that we're having year on year. And actually, the pitch improvement works are only taking us so far. We're improving our grass coverage. We've got on top of weeds. We've done our decompaction works. We feel like we've potentially exhausted what that can give us in terms of improving the drainage characteristics of our pitches. So I thought it'd be useful to talk about the turf care advisory service that we offer at the Grounds Management Association. Um, so predominantly, the reason I want to talk about this tonight is that we do offer sports turf project guidance in terms of pitch drainage, pitch improvement works where we're breaking ground, looking at leveling, etc. And for those of you that might be considering that sort of work for future years, they would normally begin with site investigations that would sort of we would have a sports turf consultant come out to you and do site investigations, ascertain what the root cause of the problems are, um, and then provide you with a detailed consultancy report that would give you something to refer to year on year, having committee meetings, kind of giving that kind of real independent source of advice around what our drainage problems are, how we can resolve them, and then potentially you could move on to getting a specification of works done that you could then use to tender for a project. So those would be the sorts of processes that you would need to go through if you were looking to secure funding support um, with the a drainage scheme in your pitches or leveling works that you might need to do. So if any of you are on the call thinking about that, then please do get in touch with your county FA, your local county FA, or indeed myself. We can obviously discuss your issues in more detail, some of the potential costs involved, and how that might work from a funding perspective. Next slide, please. Okay. Another call for questions before I dive into the pitch renovation section. But if there isn't anything, then we can move on to that, please, Vicky. So again, I'm going to try and get through this in fairly quick order so that we've got a bit of time for a Q&A at the end if anybody's got anything to discuss. But I wanted to sort of cover off quickly around planning for renovations, some of the preparation that we might think about doing to our pitches pre-renovations, and then kind of diving into kind of the key renovation practices. And kind of re-establishing our pitches after renovations have been carried out. Next slide, please, Vicky. And next slide again, please. So in terms of thinking about your renovation of your pitches, if you're thinking about doing works in spring, then ideally by now you would have had these conversations with your contractors, got a rough idea when you want the work being done, and getting the work booked in. Contractors and suppliers of materials are going to be in high demand, particularly when we've experienced the sort of winter that we have. Booking in as early as you possibly can, even if they can't give you an absolutely precise date, to get your work kind of scheduled into their program of works. It's going to be really important to avoid kind of disappointment and delay with work being done when you ideally want it to be done. Those of you that have had the benefit of a pitch power report, please do feel free to share that and use it as a point of reference with your appointed contractor as the priority works to be carried out on your site. Do think about how long your pitches can be out of use for, if at all. And if you are applying fertilizer in the spring, February is a really, really good time to think about getting a nutrient soil analysis done of your pitches to kind of make sure that the money that you're spending on fertilizer is on the right products, and that you're not wasting anything that's being put down as well. Next slide, please, Vicky. So who do I look for in terms of a contractor? So do consult with your county FA, local clubs. If you're a member of the Football Foundation groundskeeping corner, go on there and network with other clubs and get contacts. That's a platform that's now on Facebook. It's free to join. I think we've got over 1,000 members on there now, and again, you can get advice and guidance from the team of regional pitch advisors on there. I'll come back to your drain question in just a minute, if that's okay. Um, you do want to make sure that all the workers have got the required qualifications, training, experience, and insurances. We have seen a little bit of an increase in recent years with the funding that is available in lawn care providers or landscaping contractors trying to sort of take advantage of clubs that are in receipt of funding and potentially doing work with not the appropriate machinery or not necessarily with the required materials, and potentially not having the experience either. So again, the county FAs are always a good point of call in terms of getting contacts for sports turf contractors. Next slide, please, Vicky. So end of season operations. Next slide again, please, Vic. Um, so what do we want to be doing in terms of getting our pitches prepared for renovation? So ideally, we want to sort of be working to reduce the height of the grass. So if you're looking at doing works in April or early May, once we all start mowing again, we want to sort of reduce the height of the grass there. And the reason for that is to sort of make sure that when we're incorporating new grass seed into the pitches, we probably ideally want to allow it, time before we're mowing that new grass seed. And if we are mowing the existing grass down, that means it's kind of not out competing new seedlings for light, air, etc. When they're establishing. You do want to think about obviously marking out any underground surfaces and pitch corners or sockets that you've got in your pitches when contractors are working. Probably not going to be that applicable to many of you on the call, but if you were to have pop-up sprinklers or anything like that, again, making sure they're all marked up, or hydrant boxes around pitches to avoid any nasty surprises if pitches are being scarified, drained, etc. And thinking about prioritising heavily worn areas, so making sure those goal areas, etc., you're sort of getting ahead of the curve a little bit when you're doing your renovations. Do they need a little bit of sand dressing prior to the renovation work being done, just to kind of make sure that they're true and level before they're being seeded into. Next slide, please, Vicky. So scarification. So again, having a bit of an understanding of what the organic matter buildup in your pitches looks like, and if it's denser than we ideally would like, scarification is a good way of digging into that organic matter, clearing it out, getting rid of undesirable grasses. Increasingly, with the scrutiny on the use of herbicides, light scarification year on year is a good way of sort of trying to keep on top of weed populations. How intensively this is done is going to depend a lot on whether you are doing a in playing season renovation where actually you haven't got access to water, particularly on the back of the drought summit that we had last year. Thinking about actually where they're doing a renovation in the closed season when there's a higher risk of hot temperatures, dry periods might not be the best approach for you now. It might actually be that doing these works a couple of weeks before the season finishes, where if we're only lightly scarifying our pitch, disc seeding, doing a deep spike, it's not going to have a massive impact on playability, and some of those works can kind of take place when we're still likely to have mild temperatures and rainfall that are going to be able to support the germination re-establishment of the pitches. So thinking carefully about the timing of when that work's done. If you've got means of getting water on your pitches, then you can scarify a little bit more intensively. if needed. But if you haven't, it may just be that kind of a light one that's done in the spring and autumn is going to be more appropriate for you. You do need to obviously think about how you might collect and dispose of any debris or horizons that are done through scarification. And scarification can be, you know, using spring rakes on a grooming tool. It can be using a chain harrow. It can be using, spring tines behind a tractor. Um, Obviously, kind of the gold standard is to use a mechanized scarifier like we've got here that does the job and also collects the horizons as well. But clearing out that material from the sort of the crown of the grass plant can be done in a number of different ways. And is best carried out in dry conditions for the best results. Next slide, please, Vicky. So we've already touched on decompaction a little bit. In terms of just picking up on that question that was asked around how soon after being done can a pitch be played on? I'd say in an ideal world, if it was being spiked on a Monday or a Tuesday for a Saturday game, that would probably be fine. It will depend a little bit on any machinery that might be going across the pitch to kind of firm it back up before play. Um, it isn't so much that you can't play on a pitch that's kind of immediately been decompacted, certainly if it's been vertic drained, but it's more so that it will kind of loosen up the soil profile. So you can expect that you probably get it cutting up a little bit more if you are playing on it quite soon afterwards, particularly if you use kind of wider 24 mm tines those sort of tine holes are quite big. If you do linear decompaction, it may have a little bit of an impact on ball roll in terms of you might get a slight bobbly surface until that kind of settles down. But yeah, probably the best case scenario that you could hope for kind of in season would be to get it done on a Monday or a Tuesday and sort of used at the weekend. But yeah, as I touched on, we've already touched on kind of what the benefits are, but better penetration of water, air, and nutrients into the soil improves root capacity by giving the root space to grow deeper and denser, enhances overall turf health. I've sort of normally said to people that, deep spiking in particular is a little bit like a free fertilizer because of the airflow and nutrient circulation that you're encouraging and allowing those roots to access nutrients that have previously been locked up in that soil. You normally see an uptick of growth after decompaction works are done. Yeah, so next slide, please, Vicky. Yeah, so again, another practice that we normally consider is kind of the restoring of surface levels. So this can be done through top dressing with a good quality sports sand. Obviously, a true and even surface is important for player experience and safety. The sports sand has become it's always been expensive, but it has become particularly costly in recent years, and it's fairly typical to expect it to be somewhere around the 50 to 60 pound mark per ton supplied and applied. And obviously, if you're looking at applying anywhere between 30 tons for 20 to 30 tons on a full size pitch if you're doing it in season, or 60 to 80 tons if you're doing it as part of a closed season works. Obviously that stacks up to be a significant expense. I generally advocate on grassroots pitches to have a very clear idea of why you're wanting to do it. So are we applying sports sand to try and improve the surface drainage? If we are, it can take a number of years for that to have a benefit. It will probably be somewhere in the region of 5 years to get a significant amount of a build up at the pitch surface to have a significant impact on actually surface drainage. But it can be really beneficial to help firm up the pitch surface. So if yours turns into a bit of a slushy bog on the top, and gets really smeared and standing water, sand application will help to dry that up and firm up that pitch surface. If you're thinking about decompacting, spiking your pitch first and then brushing the sand into the holes, you're going to have to account for that in terms of how much you're applying. If you are doing that, it'll obviously need thoroughly brushing and drag matting into the pitch to sort of work it into that holes. That's good practice anyway to get it off the grass leaf and into the pitch surface where you want it, but it's going to be particularly needed if you're trying to work it into those holes. It might be that if you're doing a lighter dusting to sort of deal with a bobbly surface or in an even surface, that it can be sort of left on top and it doesn't need to be sort of decompacted in advance and sort of worked into those holes. Again, it's really going to depend on sort of what you're hoping to achieve when you're doing that work. But as a minimum, we want to sort of try and make sure that we're top dressing those goal areas, penalty spots, linesman's runs, centre spots, anywhere that we're kind of getting dips, hollows, and a significant amount of wear in localized areas. It's really important to use the correct grade of sand when we're applying it to sports pitches. We need to make sure that we're using an appropriate sand type that's going to promote drainage and promote grass health. We also need to try and make sure that we're keeping any sand that's delivered dry before applications and make sure that it's spread in dry conditions. Next slide, please, Vicky. And just to kind of build on that a little bit more, what sands to avoid. So fairly understandably, grassroots pitches, kind of, we've had a lot of sort of saturated standing water on goal areas this year, and I've seen quite a few posts on social media of people that are sort of quite clearly used builder sand or sharp sand to kind of do that work on those areas. And whilst in the short term it might seem like a good idea, what will happen if you apply a fine building sand to a indigenous surface is that actually that can kind of seal the pitch surface up. Water cannot move from a fine particle to a coarser one. So if you've applied that sort of material, you may need to sort of try and do your best attempts to sort of rake it away, and when you're doing your renovations and sort of access that indigenous sand below. Just pick up that question as it's on topic. Yeah, sand on first or verse drain first, then sand. I mean, again, it's going to depend a little bit on what you're trying to achieve and how you're ordering your works. Some contractors will prefer to sand dress seed, then verti-drain as a last practice, because they might be concerned about wheel marks potentially from machinery if they're decompacted first and then they're doing practices afterwards on a softer ground after it's been decompacted. They may prefer to do that practice last. I mean, basically you're either going to be punching the sand into the ground, or you're going to be kind of applying it and working it into the holes. Now, applying it and working it into the holes is going to mean that you're going to get more into the ground. But again, it's going to depend a little bit on to kind of the order of the works that you want to do, and kind of what you're trying to achieve. If you're wanting to sort of firm up the pitch surface and deal with a bobbly pitch, you probably want to leave more of that sand on the surface. If you wanted to sort of ameliorate it into the topsoil and kind of really sort of try and create channels where it's going to drain a little bit better, then that may be where you wanted to sort of spike first and then sort of brush in and drag matting that sand into the hole. So again, it's thinking about kind of what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve um, when we're doing it. But root zone sand mixture. I mean, in terms of guide prices, you can roughly expect to pay a little bit more for a root zone sand mix. But so what you really want to sort of try and do is to make sure that the sand's got um, a good proportion of kind of medium fine sands in terms of make. You ideally want it to be sort of probably 80% of the mixture or north of, as it kind of says there in text. Um, if a sand is too coarse, as you'd get with a sharp sand, that can actually destabilize the area where it's being applied as well. So if you're thinking somewhere like a goal mouth, it might actually mean that goal mouth sort of becomes really unstable. I mean, the main thing is that none of the kind of the building sands, sharp sands are of the correct grain size or sort of shape. And they often contain impurities, so it's not uncommon to find, gravels in there, bits of glass. The pH is often all over the place as well, so they don't make for a very good environment to sort of drain well necessarily or grow grass in. Um, Next slide, please, Vicky. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of what you want to be looking for. So normally it's going to be that kind of medium fine sand with some medium coarse in there as well. In terms of that makeup, kind of the highest quality sports sands will normally be north of kind of 90% in terms of the makeup. Of those, you can see how they differ there. So kind of a 70-30 is slightly more in sort of that sand soil mixture. An 80-20 would be sort of fairly typical sport sand. And then once you get above that, you're kind of getting into sort of quite high sand concentrations, all the way up to sort of a USGA spec green. But you can kind of see the bottom figure there, which is I'm getting very sciencey now, but the hydraulic conductivity will show you kind of what that material drains at as a pure product. So you can see there that kind of the millimeters per hour are sky high in terms of that material. But yeah, the basics is just sort of try and use a good quality sports sand if you can whenever you're doing works on your pitches. Next slide, please, Vicky. So yeah, I mean, we've touched on localized repairs, so I'm not going to kind of do this to death already. But yeah, ideally we want to kind of keep those goal areas level through the course of the season. In the worst scenarios, if you've got a kind of a significant dip, you may need to sort of rotivate and incorporate some more sand material and sort of bring it to a level prior to seeding. I often get people saying to me, "We've had the pitch disc seeded, it's not taken in the goal areas," and I've said, "Well, you've taken your disc seeder across a goal area that's got a great big dip in, so actually the seed hasn't actually got into the ground." Um, so ideally, we want that area to be kind of level before we're doing that disc seeding work to make sure that the seed's getting in at the depth in the area that we need. So ideally, like I said, being proactive with that sort of preparation work before renovations are done, sort of try and make sure those goal areas or low line areas are as level as they can be before the work is done. Worst case scenarios, if the damage is too severe, you may need to consider returfing, but ideally we want a thick cut quality turf, not kind of a thin roll turf that you might get from your local DIY store. Next slide, please, Vicky. So restoring grass coverage. So I've touched on it a little bit already, but without kind of access to water, seeding between kind of mid-May and August is what I'd call kind of the high risk window. So obviously kind of traditionally people have been very tied to kind of doing that end of season renovation, football finishes, then I renovate my pitch. Um, well, whilst we don't ideally want to be doing renovation works when pitches are still being played on, the fact is that if we're doing it in early to mid-April, a couple of weeks before the season finishes, and we're using something like a disc seeder that drills the grass seed into the ground at the ideal depth, by the time that seed pops its head up, it's got a decent root anchor because it's been drilled into the soil already. And by the time it pops its head up, if you've done it a couple of weeks before play finishes, chances are you're going to be towards your last fixtures anyway, potentially. Also, outside of your goal areas, doing this work in season is probably going to have good establishment results if the area isn't too high wear. Um, it's common practice in professional football to kind of do in season mini renovations, as we call them, um, as well as kind of an end of season one to kind of keep grass coverage at its maximum and keep pitches in the best condition possible. And generally speaking, you still get really good sort of germination yield and rates, even if pitches are being played on. There are various types of seeders, dimple seeders, um, are good if you're kind of heavily scarifying a pitch or you've got a relatively bare surface to work with, but the germination yield with those, because you're kind of only dimpling it into the surface, is not as high as with a disc seeder, which is why you'll hear me banging on about them quite a lot as being kind of the best solution if we're seeding into established pitches. Um, and ideally, we want to be putting down 35 grams per square meter of perennial ryegrass. That's probably going to work out to be roughly 12 to 14, 20 kilogram bags on a full size pitch. So again, if we're thinking about, we're not getting as good germination as we'd like or as good establishment as we'd like, it's thinking about actually, are we putting enough grass seed down? Um, the other thing to consider in terms of prioritizing areas is that the wings of pitches, unless they've kind of been really heavily used for drills or warm-ups or small-sided games for training, etc., tend to recover quite well on their own because naturally through play they don't get as much wear as compaction. So again, if your budgets are limited, you might want to think about actually focusing on that kind of 18-yard box to 18-yard box width of the pitch end to end, or even 6-yard box to 6-yard box, and really sort of focusing your materials and resources on those areas, particularly with sports. And for instance, that might be a consideration with the cost of it, of actually, do we just concentrate on doing that application straight down the middle of a pitch, potentially. Next slide, please, Beckett. Types of grass seed, I've mentioned it already, but perennial ryegrass is the go-to for winter pitches. Ideally, that will be a seed that incorporates 3 cultivars. So on a bag of grass seed, you'll get a little label, and they are the different names of the cultivars that make up that grass seed mixture. And a good quality grass seed will normally have at least 3 of those. 3 to 4 is typical. Next slide, please, Vicky. Growing in. So this is a particularly nice picture of training pitches at Coventry when I was there. In ideal conditions, perennial ryegrass will typically germinate in 7 to 14 days. It's obviously beneficial to provide means of watering if we can, even if that's just focusing on the most worn areas, which is often going to be your goal areas. Those areas rarely catch up. So if you've got an area that is worn or looking like it's a bit behind, it's unlikely to catch up. So give it extra attention if it needs it. If your budget allows, you could consider a pre-seeding fertilizer. They're called pre-seeders, but actually kind of the new kind of thought with those is that actually often they're best now applied a couple of weeks after seeding rather than being applied before renovations or at the point of renovations. They've done quite a lot of trials in recent years, and actually um, the research shows that the grass seed's kind of got what it needs in terms of energy and nutrients in the soil to get itself going it's then at that point of sort of germination and establishment where it needs that support potentially with an application of fertilizer. Um, if your budget only allows for one or two applications a year, you're going to want to sort of try and focus on a slow or controlled release fertilizer that's going to give you nutrition over several months rather than a straight or conventional release fertilizer that, whilst they are cheaper, give you a flush of growth and then tail off. So controlled slow release products will be more expensive, but they give you much better value for money on pitches where you're only making, maybe a couple of applications a year. And touching on that point I made earlier about mowing your grass a bit shorter before the seeding's done, ideally you want to allow the grass to reach third leaf stage, or more typically it's going to be easier to kind of, unless you know what you look at, it's probably going to be around about the 40 millimeter height before giving that new seed its first cut. Next slide, please, Vicky. And then last of all, weed control. So I've already kind of touched a little bit on scarification as being a good way of managing weeds in a mechanical way. There is increased scrutiny now on use of selective herbicides, and ideally we want to have an idea as to what the threshold, what an acceptable amount of weed coverage is on our pitches before we sort of apply herbicides as a matter of course. It's something that's called integrated weed management, and that means that we have an idea of what is an acceptable tolerance of weeds on our pitch before we try mechanical means of getting on top of weeds, such as grooming, raking, scarification, as I've touched on. And on a grassroots pitch, 5 to 10% weed coverage is probably going to be acceptable. It might be, if it's getting any more than that, that you're thinking about, okay, actually we've tried the other mechanical practices and we're still not able to keep on top of weed cover, so we might now need to consider getting somebody to apply a selective herbicide for us. Selective herbicide is the key. We are not talking a total herbicide, a Roundup, absolutely not. These are selective herbicides that target the weeds that we've got in our pitches. So they might typically be plantains, dandelions, clovers, buttercups, some of the more common weeds that we see in our grassroots pitches. There's a couple of kind of factors there to consider in terms of best conditions to make that application in. What you do have to be quite conscious of in terms of when you're doing your renovation work is timing that around when you're doing your seeding. So again, ask the contractor, what does the product label say in terms of how much prior to seeding this needs to be done, or how long after seeding needs to elapse before I reach for a selective herbicide. You'll find that some weeds don't emerge until the middle of summer. Clover's quite a good example of one that isn't very well controlled if you do it too early in the year. I used to kind of favour doing my renovation works first and then sort of doing the weed application later on into the summer, sort of 6 weeks or so after I'd done my renovations. But again, you'll need to see what the individual product label says. Next slide, please, Vicky. So I've just about managed to keep to time and allow a little bit of time for questions. Thank you for taking the time out of your evenings to listen to me ramble on about grass, which I love nothing more, but I appreciate it can be a bit boring for some. Hopefully you've all taken something out of this evening. If you have got any burning questions about your sites, then please do unmute yourselves and feel free to fire away. I can guarantee you, if you're thinking it, there'll be plenty of other people on the call that will be thinking it as well. Or alternatively, if you're feeling shy or you log off and think, oh, I forgot to ask that, then do get in touch with me. Hopefully, most of you will have my contact information. If you don't, I'll ask Kev or Vicky to pop it in the chat so that you've at least got my email address.
Yeah, I've got one hand up, Julian.
Okie dokie. So we got
I think Kevin was first.
Okie dokie, Kevin, far away.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for that. It's been really interesting.
Good.
The $64,000 question. What would you deem as a reasonable budget for a year's maintenance, but also for your close season works?
Yeah, I mean I suppose the easiest way to answer that is myself and colleagues in the Football Foundation spent a very long time formulating the grass pitch maintenance funding and the amount of money that was deemed appropriate for, if we use a full-size pitch as a guide, on a grassroots pitch we allocated £3,200 for what we deemed enhanced maintenance work. So that would cover off the work that was required, sort of pitch renovation, but also would hopefully give enough for fertilizer application and some decompaction work to take place during the season as well. I don't tend to kind of attach costs to mowing and line marking because there's kind of too many variables, and we'd normally kind of either see those as sort of in-house works or arrangements that you would have with a particular contractor looking after your site. But obviously that'll vary depending on number of cuts, frequency, how many months of the year that's being done, and similarly with line marking. But yeah, in terms of a grassroots pitch, that kind of £3,200 figure for a full size pitch is sort of roughly what we'd work to. It's not a silver bullet. That is probably a minimum, ideally. If you're looking at applying sport sand in any great quantities, that budget will be gone in one fell swoop if you're applying 60 tons, for instance. So that should probably be seen as an additional. So if that's something that you're wanting to do on your pitch every year, that figure probably needs to be closer to £6,000 than three. But as with anything, it's going to kind of come down to sort of pitch standard and what quality of pitch you're wanting to provide, hours of usage. Is your pitch being used a fair amount, or does it suffer from overplay? If it's being overplayed, if we're kind of in excess of 4 to 6 hours a week, then again, the resource inputs are going to have to reflect that as well. Hopefully that's a roundabout answer.
Perfect, thank you. Just about what we're thinking. I mean, the access to the funding and the timescale when to go for it and so forth. And not getting too political, but obviously the lease arrangements with the ground, etc., come into it. And for a club like ours, it's actually a minefield to even go down the route of funding. So we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place at the minute, because we want to do everything. And we're frustrated that we could see there's support there, but to get that support, it's just too long-winded for us to access it.
Yeah, I mean, you may have already done this, Kevin, but I'd say, seek the support of the county FA and sort of helping you try and navigate.
We're trying again. We are trying again.
In terms of trying to navigate that, the grass pitch maintenance fund in particular doesn't have strict lease or license requirements. There is a grass pitch pro forma that can be populated by a landowner that could even, for instance, if permission was provided, enable a pitch to a local authority pitch, a club that uses that regularly to access funding on those pitches. So we have tried to make that particular fund as flexible as possible. But like I said, the county fair is the best place to kind of help you navigate that and have the discussions with third parties in terms of the right questions to ask. And again, I've got a pretty decent breadth of knowledge across the funding, so if I can be any help to have conversations with third parties, etc., then do let me know.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Who was next? Who is next on?
Trevor's next.
Trevor, far away. Hope you're well.
Okay. Hi, Julian. Thanks for tonight's presentation. Got some nice bits from it. What I've got a problem with, and never had before, but a quarter of the sort of like right hand side of the pitch has suddenly decided to pull all down the one. It started as one, then there was a gap, and then 2, 3, and now it's sort of like all joined together, but it's not going any further into the pitch, and it's just though a stream has just shot out the ground, if that makes sense. Any ideas on what that could be?
I mean, my go-to is usually forgive me, I can't remember, Trevor, off the top of my head, but if you've got drainage, are there any issues with the drains underneath?
No drainage.
It could be again, it can be worth just running a string line across the impacted area and just to see if you've had, because if over time, if water consistently sits in an area, you can sort of start to get a little bit of a low-lying area that worsens over time, and any sort of low-lying area water will start to pond and collect over time. We had a particularly dry summer. Shrinking soils, as they shrink in a dry summer, again, you can get settling and cracks in ground that can move, particularly if it's clay loamy soils underneath. So those can be factors. I just love digging a big hole normally and seeing what's going on underneath. But obviously, it's not everybody's cup of tea. But unfortunately, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint, with things like that. But it's usually a process of elimination, Trevor, to try and determine. It's normally what isn't causing the problem before we get to what is causing the problem.
So is it best just to fork it? Just keep forking it and hopefully to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, touch wood. Touch wood. It looks like we're going to get a bit better weather in the next couple of days. There's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. A little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, providing it's kind of not completely underwater, you sort of start trying to get some holes in it, and hopefully the water will start to move away, and then you can take a core sample or dig a bit of a smallish hole and see what might be going on underneath. But usually if it's, I have found localized areas of pitches where there's just a pan of material underneath in that particular, it's not uncommon on made ground, grassroots pitches to find, little pockets of areas that have got rubble underneath for no particular reason. But yeah, without digging a hole, sometimes it's hard to tell. That's all a consultant will charge you a lot of money to do when they come out to site is dig a number of holes and see what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Julian. Thank you. Appreciate it.
We did have a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. I definitely have a quick read of that one, Julian.
Mole ploughing, is this a last resort? So mole ploughing is is basically kind of a machine that goes on the back of a tractor with a looks a bit like a spade, and then there's a foot on the bottom. Basically, the way that it works is it gets dragged through the soil, and it acts like a subsoiler. So in agriculture, it'd be quite a common practice to subsoil agricultural land, and kind of what that foot does in theory is it creates a channel for the water to get down, and then a hollow cylindrical hole that kind of runs underneath the water to move away. Now, mole ploughing only works in high clay soils. So the clays need to be kind of 30% or more for mold ploughing to be effective, and it's very condition dependent. One of the challenges with it can be is that if you have got clay soils where it works best, they're obviously susceptible to cracking and shrinking in the summer, and mold plough trenches can last quite a long time and crack. So I would, if you're considering that, I would get further advice on it. Try and get an idea of what the clay percentage of your soils are. But it can work effectively, and it is significantly cheaper than paying for drainage. So on the right soil type, it can be a good option.
You got
Right.
another one, Julian, about any
Got one more.
pedestrian decompaction machine.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, in terms of some of the pedestrian aerators, I mean, kind of the gold standard is something called a Toro Procore, which is a pedestrian spiker that will work to about 6 inches depth, typically with a 12 mil tine. Again, flotation tires, so they look a little bit like that Air 2 G2 machine that we saw earlier in the presentation, but actually basically a pedestrianised version of a deep spiker. They're probably the gold standard. Super Turf Manure Sisis Dart, good for localized areas. They're predominantly designed for smallish areas of ground like bowls greens, cricket squares. I wouldn't advise trying to use it on a largest area like a football pitch. It'll take you a very long time, and you won't have much of the tines left by the time you finish. On a football pitch, the tines are a bit small and they only work to about 4 inches depth as well. And unless the tines are brand new, that can be kind of 2 or 3 inches. So we ideally don't want to be working too shallow on a football pitch because it can loosen up the top a little bit. As I said, the kind of the ideal is sort of 6 inch, 150 millimeters depth, ideally when we're spiking. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Problems with worm casts, yeah, haven't we all got problems with worm casts? Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, kind of the chemical controls that were available to control worm casting aren't anymore. Sand dressing can help to dilute kind of the clay soils that you might get on a pitch surface and make it easier to disperse those casts. Dispersing them with a drag mat, brush, rake in growing season on a dry, windy day can be fairly effective, but equally it can just smear and smother the casts. It's a good idea if you can to get an idea of what your soil pH is, because neutral and alkaline soils are particularly susceptible to worm casting activity. If you've got a lot of thatch and organic matter, the worms feed on that, so again that'll increase their activity. If you're not collecting grass clippings like a lot of us wouldn't be in a grassroots environment, they will feed on that. So unfortunately it's a bit of a holistic approach now with worm control. Could consider soil acidifiers if you have got an alkaline soil, because generally the more acidic your soil, the more worms don't like it, but in turn acidifying soils can have negative impacts on other elements of turf health in terms of locking up soil nutrients and things like that. So yeah, no silver bullet there, I'm afraid. Rabbits and deers, yeah, a bit I would generally signpost people to the gov.uk website in terms of pest control to get best practice around that and sort of the most up-to-date practice in terms of legislation. Rabbits, there are deterrents in terms of, you know, fencing, rabbit skirts that can be used. I have heard people using various type of animal urine that can help to deter rabbits. Deers, I suppose, yeah, fencing would be the obvious solution. Again, with rabbits, what can help is to make sure that any holes that they're making, that the droppings have been cleared from those holes, and that you can use something like scaffold netting to kind of make the repair and sort of keep that area protected. Yeah, and question about gypsum. Yeah, gypsum, again, interestingly, I think because of how wet the winter's been, has been a fairly popular topic on a lot of the grounds forums. It's an idea that basically comes from agriculture, where gypsum's used quite a lot in cultivating grounds to do what is flocculating clay soil. So that basically means that it improves the soil structure, creates more of that pore space that we discussed earlier. The reason it works well in agriculture is because it's cultivated into the soil. So it's done part of that cultivation process. It's generally applied as a powder or as a granular product, and cultivated into the soil can work really effectively. The jury's out a little bit on whether it works so well in liquid forms or kind of applied to a pitch surface and then sort of potentially spiked in, slitted in. But given the kind of weather that we've been encountering, I'd probably take the stance of it's worth a go if it's kind of within your budgets. But yes, gypsum can be extremely effective at improving clay soil structure if you can get it in the ground. You'd probably need to sort of, if you were going to apply it as a granular product to the pitch surface, think about deep spiking at quite a kind of a close spacing to try and encourage it to kind of get it into the ground. Using a grooming tool to kind of, again, surface aeration, working it into the surface, anything that you can do like that's going to help get it in the soil and where it needs to be. Hopefully that's answered everybody's questions. Like I said, if you do jump off tonight's call and anything springs to mind, then, you know, do feel free to get in touch. I'll apologise if we ran over a little bit. I should have rambled on a bit quicker and got through my slides a bit quicker and allowed more time for questions. But thank you for bearing with us this evening, and thanks again to Staffordshire FA for hosting and you all taking time to listen to this evening's webinar.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks everyone.